Hey, it's Eric Pierce. I'm on your left, and today we're talking about Captain America, the Winter Soldier, the second Captain America film and the number one MCU film in my heart. The Winter Soldier was released in 2014, which means this is its 10th anniversary, which is just one of the reasons I want to talk about it today. It is the first MCU film directed by the Russo brothers, who also did Civil War, Infinity War, and Endgame, which is just an absolutely incredible run. I'd put it up there side by side with Christopher Nolan's Batman trilogy as far as superhero runs. I might actually put it above that. I haven't thought about it too much, but I think I probably would. It's just impeccable. What a run. Is it the greatest MCU film? I say yes, but let's see what Rotten Tomatoes says. We're just looking at the aggregate scores, which, in aggregate, I think are more or less accurate for this kind of thing. Number one, with a score of 96, Black Panther. Tied for second with 94s, the original Iron Man and Endgame. Tied for fourth, Ragnarok and Spider-Man No Way Home, both with 93s. Tied for sixth, Guardians of the Galaxy 1 and Spider-Man Homecoming, both with 92s. Tied for eighth, the original Avengers, Civil War, and Spider-Man Far From Home, and Shang-Chi, all with 91s, which means all three of the Spider-Man films are in the top 10. That's pretty amazing. Where the heck's Winter Soldier? Winter Soldier's next. It's 12th with a 90. Before we talk about the Winter Soldier, I just want to comment, what a run. 11 of these movies came during the 23-film Infinity Gauntlet story arc. That's nearly 50% of the films in the Infinity Gauntlet arc, with a score of 90% or better, which is just, no wonder the MCU was king for those 11 years. Their movies were just consistently top-notch. As for me personally, I would put the Winter Soldier higher. The only films in that list that come close to topping the Winter Soldier for me are the original Iron Man, which is just impeccable, flawless origin story. The only detriment there is the villain, the weak villain, and which kind of makes the third act not as good as what precedes it. And then Captain America Civil War, best MCU third act by far. The way that the traditional, formula of good guy versus bad guy is turned on its head in the end. Just love that. Also has the Bucky bromance, which I'm a fan of. Incredible action scenes. And in addition to all that, we get the introduction of Spider-Man and Black Panther. So just a really great film. But for me, the Winter Soldier is still above that. So speaking of the Winter Soldier, does it have the MCU's best cold open? I kind of feel like it does. Let's just break down what Winter Soldier does in the first 3 minutes of runtime. We introduce Sam Wilson, who goes on to become Steve's number 2 and an Avenger through that iconic On Your Left scene. And speaking of On Your Left, this is the first time we really see what a super soldier looks like as Steve just continues to lap him and just breeze by him. It's kind of set up as a joke, but it's a really effective way of showing what a super soldier actually would look like compared to a normal guy. We establish the setting quickly. We see DC landmarks and we know where we are, which then kind of grounds it in the tone and tenor of the film. It's funny. We get the introduction of Natasha rolling up in the hot rod, and she drops a funny line about asking for directions for the Smithsonian because she's looking to pick up a fossil, which then leads to Sam dropping a Joey Tribbiani, "How you doing?" to Natasha, taking his shot. Gotta love it. And then also, and I'll save this one for last, we get Steve's notebook, and I want to spend a couple minutes talking about that because I think there's some interesting nuggets there. But just overall, I love that cold open. I love how it establishes everything, and then we jump right into an action scene. Talking about that notebook, in it is a list of things that Steve missed while he was on ice. things that he should check out because they're noteworthy or entertaining or whatever. Stuff like I Love Lucy, the moon landing. Star Wars, which I don't want to read too much into it, but of the things on his list, and there's like 12 of them, Star Wars is the only thing crossed off. I'm dying to know what he thought of it. I just think it's interesting. It's the one thing he did get to. But the really burning question I have is, who made these suggestions to Steve? Because if you think about it, his social circle is pretty small at this point. Everyone he knows is basically dead. So he's got Peggy, who's bedridden. He has the original, the OG Avengers, Nick Fury, Natasha, Clint, Tony, Bruce, and then, a couple people from S.H.I.E.L.D., and some of the people we meet in this movie who are actually not S.H.I.E.L.D., they're Hydra. But I'm just dying to know. I mean, these suggestions had to have most likely came from people that are in his life. And so I'm just dying to know where they came from. So I'm going to run through the list here and throw out my best guesses. I think the first three suggestions, I Love Lucy, the moon landing, and the Berlin Wall, both up and down, I think those come from Peggy Carter. And my reason for that is, she's from the same generation as Steve. These were probably things that were notable for her when they happened, especially the moon landing, and then considering that she fought during World War II and so did Steve. The whole Berlin Wall thing and the Cold War and then that ending, those would be noteworthy things. So I think those are Peggy Carter suggestions. I think Tony Stark makes the next three, which are Steve Jobs. And again, that's obviously Apple. I think it's a tech thing. Tony's a tech guy. So I think that's one. Pisco, which I didn't know this, but is an alcohol. And Tony has had problems with alcohol in his storyline. And then Thai food, which there's that memorable bit in the first Avengers where he's talking about getting shawarma. So I think those are all Tony suggestions. So then we come to Star Wars, and I had to think about this one a bit. I think Clint seems like he probably fashions himself as a Han Solo type, so I think it probably came from him. In a meta sense, I think Nick Fury would be funny if he's the one who made this suggestion, because he plays Mace Windu in Star Wars. Star Trek. I think Bruce seems like he's the most likely to be a Trekkie. And I don't mean that in a disparaging sense, just as an intellectual. And he just seems like the one who would maybe suggest Star Trek. Nirvana is the oddball on this list. And I, as someone who loves Nirvana, I think whoever suggested this to Steve, someone from the 1940s, is maybe a bit mean or maybe playing a joke on his behalf, because I don't think there's anyone from the 1940s who could listen to Nirvana and would get it. So I think it's probably a joke. I also think as a generational thing, it probably is Natasha who makes that suggestion. And then there's Rocky, and then Rocky 2 ? And best guess on this one, I thought about this one a little bit. I'm going to go with Rumlow. He's like the main Hydra strike force guy who works with Cap. It's kind of like his number 2. He seems like a kind of guy who likes to box. That's my suggestion for that. So that's how I break down Cap's notebook. And I probably put too much time into that, but it's one of those in-movie artifacts that has always kind of fascinated me, and just seeing the little like Easter eggs of what's on there. So why I consider the Winter Soldier the greatest MCU film. I've got 4 reasons, and we're going to go into those right now. The first, and maybe the most important, it's the first time we see Cap 2.0. So coming into, if you can think back, coming into Winter Soldier, and even more so, I guess, Civil War, and in fact, part of what Civil War played up was who's your favorite Avenger, and you were choose a side. Are you on Team Iron Man or are you Team Cap? I think coming into the Winter Soldier, Cap was kind of just a goody-goody, but just was like he felt like a peak human, and he did some cool things in the first Avenger, but in Winter Soldier, that's the first time we actually see what a true super soldier looks like. And if you can think back to the the scene right after the cold open where they come in and Cap lands on he jumps, first of all, he jumps out of an airplane without a chute, falls into the water, and then climbs up on the boat. And then he starts sprinting around the periphery of the boat. And one of the first guys he runs up to, he kicks him, and he has to kill this guy because he sends him flying back like 10 feet. The guy hits the side of the ship and then goes cartwheeling off into the water. That guy's dead. He's dead. His bones are liquid. Cap annihilates him. And this was one of those oh crap moments. And really, for me, that was the first signal that Steve, Captain America, he's not the Captain America we knew from the 1940s. This is a new Captain America, a stronger Captain America, one who could really go toe-to-toe with the other superheroes. As you know, I talked about him jumping out of an airplane later on in the movie. He jumps out of an elevator, falls like 10 stories through a glass roof, lands on his shield, and just walks away, kind of wincing. But again, this is actual super level stuff we're seeing. And then again, also the sense of speed. We see that in the beginning with him lapping with Sam. But Cap runs like Tom Cruise wishes he could. Like, this dude sprints. And the sense of speed and the sense of power, like all these were signals that this Captain America is a new, I'm going to say better Captain America. The guy we see in First Avenger, good guy, very wide-eyed, strong, but he felt even, going into and during the first Avengers movie, he felt a clear rung down below Iron Man and Thor and Hulk. And I'm not saying he can go toe-to-toe with like Thor and Hulk, but I'm just saying there was a clear delineation between them. And coming out of the Winter Soldier, that line's a lot more blurred. Captain America is someone to be reckoned with. The other thing I'd say too, Winter Soldier is probably one of the best, if not the best, pairing of hero and villain in the MCU. I think obviously Thor and Loki are right up there. But if you think about good heroes, you need a good villain. And what is Batman without the Joker? He's just a guy who has a bat fetish, who goes around the city at night beating up people. And I think that's part of the reason, at least for me, I'm rewatching the original Superman movies right now. And you can sense that lack because the hero can only rise up as high as the villain makes him. In Superman 1, Superman's villain is Gene Hackman playing Lex Luthor, who is criminal mastermind genius. Probably the best villain, but obviously he can't go toe-to-toe with a nigh immortal super alien, which is why the end of Superman 1 has him fighting like an earthquake and some missile launches. Superman 2 we introduce Zod and his minions in the first Superman, but they don't show up till Superman 2, and they can go toe-to-toe with Superman. Probably this is the reason why Superman 2 is my favorite of these movies, because the villain is the most interesting, and again, in terms of threat level, I love Gene Hackman as Lex Luthor, but he can only scheme, and unless he's got some kryptonite hanging around, there's not much he can do. Superman 3, the villain is Richard Pryor creating AI accidentally and a knockoff Lex Luthor, more like imagine Hugh Hefner as a villain. He is basically Superman's nemesis, and during the climax they shoot missiles and things at Superman, even though Superman can't be harmed by any of this stuff. But the villain in that one is at one point Superman himself, because he turns evil, and then the best scene of the movie is basically where Clark Kent fights his inner demons, where you have Clark and Dark Superman fighting each other in a junkyard, and then again the climax he's fighting a computer. And then the fourth Superman, which I don't remember and I still need to watch, but based on what I looked at on the internet, he's fighting a metaphor for nuclear war in the form of nuclear man. I wish I was making this up. But anyway, not good villains across the board. Zod being my favorite, and obviously Lex Luthor is all time, but again, not the best threat for Superman, which is why those movies suffer, because the villains just are not on par. But in the case of the Winter Soldier, Cap and the Winter Soldier are fairly even in terms of power and ability. They're basically, on the same level, and I think you could say Steve wins the fights he wins because of his heart as much as anything else. He's the guy that says, I can do it all day, and you believe him. So that's really the differentiator in those fights. But the other thing I like about this movie, every other superhero movie since the dawn of time, essentially, ends in a fist fight. And that's just kind of the rules of the genre. But when you've seen a lot of these movies, you kind of get tired of the same old. When you know, going into the third act, you know how it's going to end. But here in The Winter Soldier, at the very end of the movie, Cap tosses his shield aside and refuses to fight. And only by refusing to fight does he win. And the victory in this case, he's already defeated the helicarriers, but really the victory he's after is he's trying to redeem his friend Bucky. So that's just, again, I'm lumping all that up under Cap 2.0, but that's my first reason why Winter Soldier is the greatest MCU film. The second reason, the supporting cast. You can't really say, I'm not going to argue the Winter Soldier supporting cast is better than like the Avengers or Civil War, where every superhero ever is in the movie, basically, because that's silly. But if you just look at who's in this movie and what they do, I think this is the best supporting cast, because these are not guys that are just here for a couple scenes. These are characters who are given important things to do in the story. I'm going to start with Sam Wilson, MCU's best wingman. Obviously, that's a wing joke, but I totally believe it. He's Steve's ride or die. We first get him here, and Anthony Mackie, love him. He does great stuff there. My bigger reason to argue for the best supporting cast are really the next two. I think this is peak Natasha. I'm a huge Natasha Romanoff fan. We get some great fight scenes with her, and we get to see her do her patented, I'm going to jump on your shoulders and use my momentum and my iron thighs, I guess, to swing you around. We see some of that. More importantly for me, we get to see her as a character. I think there's glimpses along the way in primarily the first Avengers movie about who she is as a person. But here we get to see all sides of her. We get to see that she's comfortable with duplicity. In that first mission where they go to the hijacked ship, she's off doing something, I don't want to say illicitly, but that Steve doesn't know about. She has her secret mission that might compromise the greater mission, but it doesn't, because Nick Fury sent the greatest soldier in history to make sure it doesn't happen. But at the same time, she's off doing her own thing, and she sees no problem with that. Like, compartmentalizing is just who she is. And in fact, we see that later on, because she's a chameleon. She even says to Tony, she even says to Steve when they're riding in their stolen truck, that the truth is a matter of circumstance. It's not all things to all people all the time, and neither am I. And then she asks Steve, who do you want me to be? So just really interesting insights into her, the Soviet era spy turned hero. Additionally, and these are probably my favorite parts of her, we get to see emotion from Natasha. She's not always just she has this great line in the movie about, I don't know everything, I just pretend I do, something to that effect. But then when it seems like Nick Fury's dead, that's the most human we ever see her. She's completely shook, she's emotional, she's teary-eyed. And it makes sense. Fury gave her purpose, he gave her a home, he gave her a family through the Avengers. So, and all that's great stuff. And then I love the immediate pivot she makes, even in her grief. She turns on Steve and starts asking him questions. Why was Fury in your apartment? What's he doing there? And she knows from Steve's answers that he's lying. So she's already starting to put things together. Just great stuff. And then Probably one of my favorite things about the movie Natasha is at the end when she chooses to release all of S.H.I.E.L.D.'s secrets on the internet, which it also exposes to expose Hydra. This also burns her own covers. So all her aliases and everything that she's built up as a lifelong spy, that's all out in the wild. And so she has to start rebuilding that. I just think that's an interesting character choice and a sacrifice that she makes to choose to put aside the person who can compartmentalize in favor of the greater good. And of the MCU's missteps during kind of this peak period, this is probably my main complaint, that they didn't bite and do something with Natasha coming out of this movie to kind of explore the fallout of that choice. I think there's a lot of interesting ways you could pursue the character in her story that unfortunately we never get. Related to Natasha, I have to talk about Natasha's relationship with Steve, which, of all the fun MCU pairings we've had along the way, Steve and Bucky, Tony and Rhodey, Peter Quill and Gamora, name your favorite. This is probably my favorite, just because I love the energy you get by bringing this by-the-book soldier from the 1940s, pairing him with a modern woman who plays by no rules, essentially, and just seeing how they interact, seeing how they learn to trust each other over time. And then just all their interactions are just really fun. You can kind of tell that both Scarlett Johansson and Chris Evans are friends in real life, because there's just a fun playfulness to their interactions when she's asking Steve if that was his first kiss since 1945. And there's the whole running joke or subplot about her trying to hook up Steve with some girls. She's very concerned about his love life, which I think is just kind of hilarious. And again, I think, just the whole gentle ribbing she does with him, just really love that. And then again, kind of the scene where we see them at the mall where they're trying to figure out what's on this USB drive, and S.H.I.E.L.D. is then on site, or S.H.I.E.L.D., but S.H.I.E.L.D. / Hydra is on site looking for them, and then Natasha is using all her tricks to get them out of the mall. Walk, don't run, put your arm around me, laugh at something I said, give me the kiss. Just, it's really cool to see Steve, the guy who could punch his way out of pretty much anything, kind of suppress that part of himself and follow Natasha, who is the expert in this scenario, and just follow her lead totally. I just like that a lot. And then the other excellent supporting cast member, this is also peak Nick Fury. So we have peak Natasha in this movie. We also have peak Nick Fury. Two of the original Avengers. We have their peaks in this movie. Nick Fury, this is the only time in all of the MCU movies where we actually see him as an action hero. It's been a minute since I've seen Captain Marvel. I seem to remember Nick Fury having some action scenes in that movie, but they were more of the like rent-a-cop variety. He was kind of just there being the human, seeing everything Captain Marvel's doing, and it wasn't super impressive action, so he does mix it up a little bit. But outside of that, for the most part, he's only ever a desk jockey. He's there giving orders and kind of manipulating things behind the scenes, but he doesn't really do anything else. And this is the one time where we actually see him in action scenes, and you can see why he's one bad mofo. I think the chase scene where he's cruising around in his Escalade, and all these guys who are posing as cops are starting to attack him, and he's trying to get off the grid. For me, that's probably the best chase scene in the MCU. I think the other obvious contenders that come to my mind right now, I think the Black Panther chase scene in Black Panther 1 that occurs in South Korea, that's right up there. That's a really good scene. There's also in Ant-Man 1, there's a chase near the end of that movie with all the shrinking of the cars, and then you got giant Ant-Man kind of like riding a truck like a skateboard. That's a fun scene, but it's not as good. And then in Civil War, you got that really good three-way chase with Bucky, Black Panther, and Captain America, with a lot of it on foot and them sprinting faster than cars. That's another good one too. But for just sheer thrills and excitement, I think the Nick Fury chase scene is the best. And yeah, I also liked that this is the one time, similar to Natasha, this is the one time where Nick Fury is actually shook. He always seems like he's like 3 or 4 steps ahead of everyone else, and has a certain smugness about it. But in this movie, the smugness is wiped off his face. He doesn't know who he can trust. He almost dies. And that allows him as a character, I think, to raise his game. And again, I think this is just his peak Nick Fury. Third reason that Winter Soldier is my favorite MCU film. It just has incredible action scenes. It's kind of an oxymoron when you talk about the MCU, because part of the reason we love these movies is because, by and large, every one of the movies has an excellent action scene. But when you just look at the totality of the action in The Winter Soldier, there are very few MCU films that can go toe-to-toe with it. I'm just going to run down a quick list, and then I'll comment on some of them. We have the opening scene on the hijacked ship where Steve is sprinting around, taking guys out, and then we get Natasha doing her thing. We get the Nick Fury chase scene. We get the assassination attempt on Nick, and then Steve chasing the Winter Soldier. And it's a short scene, but there's just a visceralness to it as Steve's jumping through windows and running through doors and bouncing off walls. That's just really good. Of course, the elevator scene, it's got to be up there in any kind of top 10 list of MCU action scenes. I loved how claustrophobic it is. Everyone's tightly packed. Steve's in there with like 12 guys, and some of them are hulking guys. They've got magnetic cuffs. They've got shock sticks. And the whole scene lasts like not even a minute, I think. But I just love the grittiness. The grittiness to the Winter Soldier is part of the reason I love the film in general. But that scene is just very visceral, in your face, and I'm a big fan of that. And then we get the highway scene where they have Jasper Sitwell sitting in the back seat, and they're going to get into S.H.I.E.L.D., and then the Winter Soldier jumps on the roof and rips Sitwell out of the back seat and throws him in oncoming traffic. And then he rips the steering wheel off the car, so they can't control where they're going. That ends up, the car crashes, whatever. And Steve gets blasted off the overpass into a bus. And we get some scenes with Bucky and his goons. Is it fair to call him Bucky? Should I call him the Winter Soldier? We know who he is. But Winter Soldier and his goons taking on Sam and Natasha, and then Steve gets back in the fight, and you got the guy with the Gatling gun. And that all is just the lead up to the main event, which is mano a mano, Cap versus Winter Soldier. And even that fight, I love the progression of it. It starts out, Winter Soldier's wielding like an M16, and then he switches down to an Uzi, and then a pistol, and then a knife, and then before you know it, they're going hand to hand. And by the way, I just love the Winter Soldier's knife work in this film, the whole knife flip, and he's just really good with the knife. You can tell he's sliced and diced in his day. The changing hands, the speed with which he works, it's all good. The whole fight just feels like two superpowered dudes going head to head. Lots of big jumps. We get throws. Concrete gets busted. Cars are dented. There's just this visceral energy to the whole thing that I think, I talked about this film feeling gritty, and a lot of the MCU fights they're CGI filled. My big reason, the number one MCU film according to Rotten Tomatoes is Black Panther, and I love Black Panther. It's definitely a top 10. It's not number one for me though, because the third act is just a CGI fest, specifically the fight between T'Challa and Killmonger. There's like no weight to it. It's just two cartoon guys fighting each other, and that's kind of that's the downside to that film for me. But here, the fight feels real. It feels like it's grounded in the real world, and I just love it. We even get Cap even suplexes the Winter Soldier at one point. I mean, come on. Let me tell you something, brother. If a movie's got a suplex in it, I'm there for it. And the other thing I'll say too, I love how the Winter Soldier's metal arm almost feels like, remember in video games, like the old PlayStation 2, some of the controllers you get from like Mad Catz or these third-party vendors would have like turbo buttons or switches you could flip that would then, enable turbo power. That's what the Winter Soldier's metal arm feels like to this movie, because it feels like it just powers up at points, almost as though he's just got an internal nitro or something in the arm. And yeah, so I think when you talk about set pieces, I think obviously the Civil War airport scene, that's a huge set piece. Pretty much most of the Endgame climax is a bigger set piece, and obviously you can talk about the big three, Iron Man, Captain America, and Thor going head-to-head with Thanos. That's one of the best scenes in the entire MCU. I don't think the Winter Soldier can compete at a set piece level, but I think when you just look at the action scenes all together, and again, just the kind of action scenes they are, I just find that they're better than anything else we've seen in the MCU. And then my fourth and final reason I consider this my favorite MCU film is because it's not just a comic book movie. It actually has something to say that's deeply relevant even today. It was made 10 years ago, but it's still relevant. It probably will still be relevant in the years to come. It's a deeply paranoid movie. None of the characters are sure who they can trust, whether you're talking about Nick Fury, Natasha, or Steve. Obviously, conspiracies are super timely to this, in our current day and age. And fascism, sad to say, remains in vogue. And Hydra is a fascist organization corrupting a good institution from within. Tell me if that doesn't sound familiar. I guess I just think, what's more relevant, a genocidal purple alien or the creeping suspicion the government is up to some shady crap? You tell me. I also think the overriding theme of the movie, freedom versus fear, what will you sacrifice for safety, how government organizations or whatever will play into your fears, it just remains relevant today. And I think of all the comic book movies, the Winter Soldier is one of the ones that has the most to say about society and the world itself. It's not just about guys in tights punching each other. It actually is about something. So those are my 4 reasons that I think The Winter Soldier is the best MCU film. I'd love to know what you think about it. I'm not quite done talking about it though. I do want to talk about Hydra. Hydra's been around since the first Avenger. They're Cap's primary antagonist through the first 2 films. In the first Avenger, though, Hydra is mostly just an extension of the Red Skull, and it doesn't really exist as an organization per se. I mean, they've got an army and stuff, but all that feels kind of like Nazi army adjacent. Winter Soldier, Hydra is a malignant entity, and you have the sense that it is something beyond just kind of one person. So I love that part of it. I always liked Rumlow. He seemed like an actual decent guy, and I was always a little bummed when it turns out he's actually this raving fascist, because I liked the dynamic he had with Steve. But, that's what happens, I guess. Alexander's heel turn was the least surprising in history, probably because they cast Robert Redford, and a guy like that's not going to take a role in a comic book movie unless there's something more to it. But maybe it was just a check. I don't know. But I do think it's a little weird that Alexander Pierce plots against the guy that saved his daughter's life and also tries to kill him. So I guess he's all about that Hydra life. There's also, I call him Slick. I don't know what this guy's name actually is. He's like Rumlow's number 2. It's the tall guy with the slicked back hair who always looks really pissed off. He has a name. I have no idea what it is. So there's the scene where Cap and Winter Soldier have their fight in the street, and then S.H.I.E.L.D., quote-unquote, S.H.I.E.L.D. arrives to arrest our heroes. And this guy, who I'm naming Slick, puts a machine gun to Steve's head in broad daylight while helicopters are circling. And you can just see on his face, this guy just hates Steve. And obviously, he could just be about the Hydra life. He could just be drinking the Kool-Aid. Maybe he's stirring the Kool-Aid. But I kind of wonder if there's something else to that. I feel like maybe he suggested Steve watch Roadhouse and put that in his little notebook. And Steve was like, what? What's it about? Bouncers? In Missouri? I think I'll pass. And then this guy took it personal. And now he's got out for Steve. I don't know. That's just me filling in blanks. The other thing I'll say about Hydra real quick, I have to wonder, where the heck are they keeping Bucky? It looks like they're keeping him in a bank vault, I guess for security purposes. What's with the guy with the bow tie? It looks like he's working in an ice cream parlor. Does that guy work at Baskin Robbins? Is this why Baskin Robbins always finds out? Is it secretly a Hydra front? At the top of the podcast, I talked about the top 10 MCU films according to Rotten Tomatoes. In closing, I thought it would be fun to run down my personal top 10 just as a comparative point. So number 1, The Winter Soldier. I just spent 30 minutes talking about why, so hopefully you understand where I'm coming from on that one. Number 2, I have Civil War, which along with The Winter Soldier is kind of the second half of the Steve and Bucky bromance, and I'm very pro Bucky bromance. I wrote an entire piece about that. I'll drop that in the show notes. But Civil War, I mentioned it earlier too. I love the third act of that movie, the way that it seems to be set up towards a traditional good guys are going to come together and fight a bad guy, and then it totally turns on its heel. We get the reveal about how Tony's parents actually died, and that movie also then springboards what comes later on with Infinity War, with the Avengers being split up and then the fallout of all that. So just love that movie. In number 3, I have the original Iron Man 1. Number 4, and this is really like a tie with number 5, I have Infinity War and Endgame 4th and 5th. They are really two halves of a whole. Infinity War kind of has that Empire Strikes Back ending where it kind of ends on a down note, kind of ends on a cliffhanger. The bad guys win, which that's one of the reasons it's a little above Endgame for me, is not that I like to see the bad guy, or not that I like to see the good guys lose, but when you see the good guys win all the time, it's refreshing to see them get knocked down, which, again, that's another reason I like Civil War. But of the two, I prefer Infinity War a little better. I think the pacing is really good. We get lots of fun action scenes and humor. Endgame is a lot more dour, and at least the first half of the film the pacing is a little odd still. Obviously, the third act is just fire. Coming at number 6, I have Spider-Man Homecoming. I just love the John Hughes energy of that film. I like seeing Peter as a teenager dealing with teenage things as he's trying to grapple with these powers he has, and then I like the bleeding of Tony Stark's world into Peter's. All that's good stuff. Number 7, I have Guardians of the Galaxy 1. Number 8, I have the first Avengers movie. Originally, this movie was much higher up on my list, but then as we've gotten more MCU films, like during the Thanos saga, the Avengers gradually got pushed down because some of the later movies ended up just being bigger and better. Number 9, I have Black Panther, and then rounding out my top 10, I have Thor Ragnarok. That wraps up this episode. We'll be back next week talking about The Phantom Menace, which is celebrating its 25th anniversary. I have a lot of thoughts about the movie and about the anniversary and things I was doing back in 1999. If you like the podcast, check out allthefanfare.com for long-form articles and a weekly newsletter. And until next time, I am still on your left. Peace.